Hello and welcome to this week's episode of GND Media. I'm your host Andrew Glassford, and if I'm speaking quietly, it's because I've got my 7-day-old son sat behind me, who you may hear. We're all doing great. Thanks to people that have reached out, and if the schedule's going to be a bit knackered, it's because we're working out how to raise a child. So things will be back to normal in a couple of weeks, hopefully. This week's episode is all about energy, and not just in a kind of abstract sense, but what are the fundamental physical and material changes that are going to be needed to get Britain to net zero by 2030, as the Labour Party plans it to be. Labour have been in power now for about 3 months. We've heard some noises from how GB Energy is going to be constructed, so I brought in some of the best people I know to talk about energy in the UK, and that's Keir Milburn from Abundance, Ellie Radcliffe from Carbon Co-op, and Melanie Brusseler from Commonwealth. And we kind of discuss, well, what are Labour's plans for GB Energy? What is GB Energy going to do? What is it not going to do? How is it going to engage with the private sector? Is this just PFI with a different coat on? And we also discuss energy isn't just a thing. It isn't just, turning on a light switch. It is a fundamental part of basically of civilization, and what our relationship to that is changes how we have a relationship with each other and with wider society. So we're going to get into, if we're going to envision a better world around energy, what that might look like as well. It's a great conversation. Really pleased to have everyone on the show. Thank you to Ellie for co-hosting as well. And yeah, all the links are in the description to everything we talk about. This was recorded back on September 15th, I believe, so some things may have changed since then. But I think everything we've said is still pretty relevant. So I hope you enjoy the show. Please like and share and subscribe to the podcast if you're enjoying it. I've got to raise a child, got to pay some bills. Go on, you can join the Patreon. All the links for the show are in the description.
Labour have just come into power. I assume there's lots of big problems with the energy market, otherwise they wouldn't be so keen on reforming things. So let's start with Ellie and Melanie. What's like the biggest problems right now in terms of like getting to net zero for 2030 and Labour's target when it comes to the energy market? Just a nice simple question to start us off.
I'll let Melanie go first, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, so I find it helpful to like even just go back a little bit with like what is power sector decarbonization, because I think many people have a common sense idea or understanding of decarbonization as just being green line needs to dramatically go up, carbon line needs to go down. And that's true in a sense, but I think it kind of doesn't really capture the fact that we're trying to alter complex systems, and there's a certain level of like system maintenance of both at the same time, and also phasing one in, one out. So to kind of take a step back, electricity, like in a physical sense, is kind of broken up into a few different types of activity. You have generation, transmission, which is kind of like a long distance, sending of electrons across, large swaths of area. And then usually local distribution networks that are kind of like connecting your home or, local businesses and public areas to the grid. And in a physical sense, the renewable system is like very different from the fossil system, just in terms of like the geospatial aspects where fossil fuel generators are sited. It's very different from renewables, etc. So you really need to just rebuild the whole system once over to just kind of like build out that infrastructure. But then also it's like very different to operate these two systems, and so you need different ways of organizing the entire system to achieve it. And in the UK context, the electricity system's gone through different phases. So in the post-war era, you guys, I'm an American, I live in the US, so I saw this from a little bit of afar, but the UK had a fully like socialized and fully integrated system. So across generation, transmission, and distribution, it was publicly owned. And so that kind of led to, that was the system through which the UK really built out its electricity sector. Even the transmission system, like the preponderance of that physical infrastructure was really kind of coming from that period. Whereas now, because of Thatcherism, privatization across the 80s and 90s, the system is fully fragmented, fully marketized, and organized around the profit imperative, which means that you just have tons of different actors who have control over investment decisions and also operation of the system. And we're trying to cohere them into this really grand project of both investing in the right things, divesting from the wrong things at the right time, and then also kind of balancing the grid in real time too, and trying to cohere all of these actors. Yeah. And so I would say that the biggest problem is this architecture where you just have really fragmented agency, even with the idea of all these actors being guided by the profit imperative, as you've discussed with Brett. Profitability actually is a huge concern for renewables, and so you have this kind of hybrid regime where you have really strong state intervention into the sector to try to induce investment and certain types of interventions to kind of get renewables online. But it just, again, it's so fragmented. We're trying to just kind of use these indirect nudges to herd cats, just do what we want them to do, so, as opposed to just doing it ourselves.
Is it to the point where, say, I don't know, so me and I live in Manchester, we're in Electricity Northwest's region for distribution, and say a pylon goes down on my street or a substation, is it even to the point where actually Electricity Northwest don't even do their own maintenance, and there's some subsidiary company that has all the contracts for doing maintenance to that level where even the problems inside of companies have gotten ridiculous, or is it at least there's some semblance of logic to it outside of the need to be all broken up?
No, I'd say that the current structure really is illogical, even leaving aside the need for the transition. I mean, I think, to be fair to people who were kind of arguing for privatization, kind of on their terms, their argument at the time was that the electricity sector kind of in this nationalized form had really built out a lot of infrastructure. The argument was, we kind of have built out the system. Now, if you allow for private ownership of these assets, they'll operate it more efficiently, i.e. they'll pay workers less and charge more or whatever. But so even without this huge renewable build out necessity, I think that there's a lot in terms of just dysfunctions around, there's not really a great incentive for these actors to be maintaining their current infrastructure, right, even. Yeah. And the corporate structure, as you said, can kind of lead to all these, shady dealings.
And I suppose, to your point, because this isn't an easy process to do, it's really the cajoling of private enterprise to be doing it is going to have to be to such an extent for them to get off their backsides and go, okay, we will invest in the billions just to deal with national grids, which I believe is also quite a big problem. So even the bones of the system are privatized to a point where we have to do loads of other stuff that's more difficult because we don't own it directly.
Yeah.
Fantastic. In terms of the scale of the challenge, Ellie, you might, I think you'll know this. In terms of how much renewable generation is there in the UK right now in terms of a percentage? I know it fluctuates day to day, but are we at 10% renewables, 25%? What are we looking at?
Good question. I don't know the answer off the top of my head, but it's not enough.
I have it in my notes if we need it.
Go on, Melanie. Go for it. Yeah.
Well, it's a pretty subjective number, as you said, just because day to day it can fluctuate, and also gas plays a kind of more fluid role. But I think it's around 40% gas, 30% renewables, heavily wind, and then the rest is kind of a mix of kind of kooky things.
Kooky things? Do you mean biogas and?
Yeah.
I think there was an idea out near Ilkley about having a weight system where you use electricity to make a weight, pull a weight up a hill, and then you would slowly throw it back down the hill. It's
like energy storage, yeah.
Yes, that's it. Yes, it sounds more reasonable when you say it like that, as opposed to the kind of Goliath King Kong thing I've got in my head. Okay, so I think that's kind of a good rough scene of the difficulties at hand. Now,
can I just interject?
Oh, please, yeah.
No,
Keir, then Ellie.
Sorry, Ellie. No, I was just going to say that, building out a non-fossil infrastructure, that's only like part of the problem. The other part, like, 'cause you can build out renewable infrastructure, but like the other part is you've got to stop fossil fuel companies taking fossil fuels and burning them, basically, because that's what's been happening. Like, both have been being done at the same time, so emissions don't go down. Well, fuck, that's of no use to anyone, basically. Do you know what I mean? I think that's an important point just to get in, because I think later on when we talk about the logic that Labour Party are sort of semi-following, it's like a really important point, basically. That's the problem that they're going to have to try and face in some sort of way.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads me on to the point about, well, and we'll come on to it maybe with some of the other intricacies about where places like Drax fits into all this, because it's kind of trying to do, it's both sides of the same arse, I would say, Drax. You know, it's trying to demonstrate one thing and do the other at the same time. Ellie?
Yeah, no, I was going to add, on top of kind of the technical and economic points that Melanie and Keir have made, I think it's also very important to point out the social. So when we're thinking about what's required for a transition to be successful, people need to be involved in this process. And currently, so much of the conversation is about the kind of the techno-economic elements of what's going on. And obviously ownership is a massive part of that. Like, well, it's all of it. Like, I'm sure, like, having done the work that I did at CLES, it's very obvious. But I think that when it comes to the way that the transition needs to happen, people need to see the benefits and people need to be bought into this. And it's not a case of just de-risking projects by engaging with people and being like, oh, they said it's fine now. It's like, actually, how our community is going to, like, see the actual benefits of this. And when you look at the way that a lot of kind of renewables have been rolled out in other countries, like in Denmark or in Germany, and the Renewable Energy Acts they have there, and the sort of work that's been done around like ownership and financial benefits as a product of this stuff, it's really important to consider that within the context of the way that we're seeing this transition, which I think is why the local power plan is quite interesting as well, when you see what Labour's going to be doing, hopefully. But how that plays out is a big question mark, so it'd be interesting to maybe touch on that a bit later.
Can I just give a little bit of flavour to that?
Yeah.
So at the more extreme end of that, you see things such as 15-minute city conspiracies and anti-ULEZ activism. Do you know what I mean? It's like all right, 15-minute city conspiracy theories are a little bit on the more wackier end of that, but like always in this nonsense, there's a moment of good sense, isn't there, basically? And like, these are people who are intuiting that under the current balance of forces, basically, they are the ones who are going to carry the can. Basically, they're the least powerful people. So if that gets warped into something which is basically not true, but like, I think that's just a flavour of to add flavour to what you were saying, Ellie. Like that's the consequence, and like the other consequence of people less engaged, etc., etc. But on the far side, you get people who are actively against this project to save the world.
I think to add to that, and this might sound strange at first glance, but I think that it's a huge problem that people like don't always like start from the premise that like renewables aren't always great, or it's not just like this like apolitical or like neutral thing. And I obviously like my life's dedicated to supporting renewable development, but I think that there is a problem in the climate community where like green capital, and not just finance capital, but like renewable developers are seen as being like really important to champion, and then like their interests need to be championed by any given climate NGO or environmental NGO to kind of achieve decarbonization ends. And I think that could be like a big problem as well.
Yeah, I think, and I fall prey to this all the time, like in my day-to-day job working in the council, but like, because the task feels so enormous with the lack of resources that are available right now, it's like, well, okay, if Dave's decarbonising dog is gonna get all the carbon out of the out of the city, and it only costs us £1 billion, then great, I'll let it happen. Like, be damned the consequences. But actually, it is the process of it all is what will make it a success or a failure. Outside of the physics of it, because if we get to a decarbonised authoritarian state outside of, well, we're doing that in many different ways for a different podcast maybe, but like if we get there in a way that's just ruins what fabric of society is left, then we've lost so much to gain a lack of civilization, I would say. I think
can I just make one tiny point? No, the only other good point to make, I think, is like decarbonisation is not the only aim. It's not the like global heating is not the only ecological crisis, unfortunately.
No,
We're in
you're
a
right.
sixth great extinction, etc., etc. But I think that's important as well, because that sort of makes us think, well, can we tackle decarbonisation in a way that puts us in a better position to tackle the other ecological crises we're facing?
Like, I do wonder with this, actually, is that do we end up going for a technological and technocratic approach because it feels less political? Like, this is maybe a wider point, but I was having a conversation with my friend Lindsay today about how, like, I don't feel that, moving on to Labour, I feel like the fights right now about the winter fuel allowance, it isn't really like politics in the grand sense. It's not like the battle of ideas in terms of like how we will look at how the world to be shaped. It is a very small area, and it's getting people to fight about percentage points. They really don't want to talk about the idea of, is it good or bad to support people with their energy bills and support pensioners? Like, and I feel like they're trying to lead us to a point where they're going to talk about the economy and energy like it is a machine, like it is, there's cogs that are broken and we just need to, oil it in the correct way. Please, no one clip that. That's not available for memes. And then it will be fine. Which, to all the points you've just made, guys, that's not going to be the case.
Can I disagree with you though, Andrew?
Oh, go on then.
Sorry, Ellie. I keep jumping in before.
It's all right. You go for it.
I think the winter fuel allowance is like big politics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because
I
it's
would
like
agree,
it's on
yeah.
a principle. It's like do you have universalism or do you have means testing? And behind that is like big like political ideologies basically, and that's why they're fighting hard about this thing which doesn't make a lot of political sense, because they want to roll back other universal sort of principles around welfare, for instance, and these sorts of things, and I imagine the NHS, etc., basically.
So you see that as like kind of a they won't say, like, I've not heard like Labour politicians in the government talk about universalism as an idea, but they will fight about this specific space and use that as like that's the battleground for it, but behind it is where that's going on.
It's a good battleground because it's like, well, there's so much support has gone to pensioners. They've had all of this asset wealth, etc., etc. But like behind that is a principle of like, basically welfare should be universal, because that's the way it stays and it doesn't become sort of, something which can be politically attacked and diminished, etc.
Labour said that they want to get the energy grid to be decarbonised or net zero. So, there's going to be some offsetting. They'll plant some trees in Herefordshire by 2030. People may remember that in 2019, when like the big XR demos happened, that a lot of 2030 targets came out and went to local authorities. I know a local authority I work at has got a 2030 target for decarbonisation. And that felt like a jump back then in terms of that's a really ambitious goal, but if we, had the show of will and force, we would get somewhere and get towards it. Now we're 5 years away. As far as I'm aware, Labour have said their flagship GB Energy will generate and support generating programmes. Do we actually know what GB Energy is right now, or is everything still pretty vague?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's early days, which could mean that it could be positive in the long run, or it could be a bit disappointing in the long run. I think that based off of how things are currently going, the biggest thing is that the capitalization is quite small. I think if you could imagine a really, really ambitious government coming in and setting up an institution very quickly and kind of getting the ground running. But institution building is quite difficult, so I think that it's important to acknowledge. But at the same time, the capitalization is quite low. Commonwealth, in our big flagship report on GB Energy in the winter of last year, had called for, I believe it was £40 billion across the first parliament, and the idea being that it would invest in the preponderance of electricity generation, or in new renewables, that is. Whereas the capitalization currently is supposed to be a little over £8 billion across the first parliament.
So that's the amount of money they'll put up for building stuff. So that's quite a lot less.
And actually, it might not. It might. The way that these things do sometimes work, though, is the capitalization. Hopefully, by the end of the first parliament, it'll be able to tap bond market. That's very common for state enterprises. You would want it to be doing that. That's how the TVA in the United States, for example, finances itself. So the initial capitalization could lead to further spending power down the line.
Right.
But for sure, it's quite low currently. And I think that especially for early projects, it does look like it will be co-investing with the private sector, which that can be a little bit difficult to gauge on day one, because again, institution building can be quite difficult. So
Right.
you could imagine different scenarios where, say, they bring certain existing renewables under public ownership by like buying them out or nationalizing them to kind of like be building both an asset base and also a revenue base. Or there could be like projects that could have a majority stake by the state to kind of like be building again the revenue and operational capacity of the institution. But from the outset, it's not clear what that's going to be doing until like these first investments are made.
Right. And then so we don't really know how they're going to do this either, in terms of like who's actually going to build it, because this is where my fear creeps in terms of, okay, this ends up being a Serco project or something similar, where they go, okay, here's 2 billion quid to some big kind of conglomerate, go and build us X megawatts of wind power. Has there been any kind of like signals of how they're going to do any of this in terms of like the material aspects yet, or is it still very much all on paper right now?
There has been lots of signals, I was going to say, during the election, but they were contradictory. Right. And like it seems to me that there are like different wings of the Labour Party who are fighting about this, who want it to be like they want GB Energy. One wing wants GB Energy to be more of a de-risking of private investment sort of. And other people don't. They want it to be something else, basically much more about like public coordination of economic activity, etc., etc.
I do think one initial victory was in the King's speech a few months ago, and then in subsequent like legal and parliamentary documents, it has been asserted that GB Energy will own and operate assets, which I think that like does make it very clear that it's not just meant to be a co-financing vehicle, which is I think a very important distinction. And as it pertains to how it might relate to the private sector, I think that it's actually really important for like people on the left who might be trying to push for a better development of the institution to be like pushing for certain distinctions around like there's co-financing to kind of just have BlackRock own it versus versus like currently there's like a handful of global players that build offshore wind in global context.
Right.
If GB Energy on day one contracts Vattenfall to physically build a project because they have the capacity to do that, but then GB Energy owns it outright and operates it over time, I think that you are in the politics of what is like how to like run public procurement in a non dodgy way, which I think is probably a big problem in the UK. So not downplaying that is a huge political problem, but I think that is a different scenario than the like we're co-investing for BlackRock to own this, like kind of like pointing out that there are different types of private actors in this space, and how they're involved might actually really matter for GB.
So I had a quick question about some of what you said, Melanie, because what you were saying about kind of institution building really being a challenge is quite interesting when we think about the pace that we need to move at, given that we've got 5 years to meet that target. And I think given that it seems like even with those kind of potentially contradictory like ideas of what GB Energy should be within the Labour Party, they seem to be trying to do things differently. So I was just wondering, and I mean, Melanie and Keir, given the pace that we need to move at, given the challenges of institution building, given the scale of what needs to happen, what should the landscape of ownership look around this? Because it's going to look different at different scales. So I'd be really interested to know kind of what you think this should look like, because GB Energy is going to have so much of a role, but like what does this look like at different scales?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm perhaps like in my own sense also like I don't live in the UK, so for me it's like a bit more like standing back, but I think that like I feel pretty flexible around how GB Energy could sort of develop in terms of kind of subsidiary ownership and democratic structures, in terms of like how can local and regional cooperatives then feed into the grid. I think that one thing that is quite positive about having a public energy company, even if it's like currently not well capitalized and it's not this like big whale that we want it to be, is that it just simply is a public institution that could develop and do further functions over time. And I do think that with like physical decentralization of like a major thing like electricity, it does, I think, in some senses require centralization elsewhere in like abstract terms, which is not to like just open up that kind of can of worms, but like just in terms of like having grid balancing, it would need to have like some level of like public coordination at a grander scale anyway. And so I think that kind of thinking about the energy system as a whole that's in flux and how there could be developments in one sphere, such as the build out of more distributed or kind of localized generation infrastructure through the local power plant, that then might raise problems with grid balancing, and then we should be kind of ready to pounce and say, well, grid balancing is a public, service that should be just done by, and kind of like making the argument for how these things could like be building towards the ultimate goal of a fully public and, vertically reintegrated electricity system, even if there's like quite a lot of room for cooperatives and local democracy there.
We should probably mention the local power plan, which is like part of this GB Energy sort of program. So in the manifesto, the Labour Party manifesto, it was, they're going to partner. GB Energy will partner with like energy companies, local authorities, and cooperatives to sort of like build out smaller scale sort of energy generation. Is the idea, I think. Another part of the Labour Party manifesto was they want to double the number of cooperatives, etc. These sorts of things. Probably doesn't make it in terms of the number of enterprises.
Which is not many cooperatives, to be honest.
But like it's still like there's obviously it's a noble
goal, yeah.
who are sort of pushing that line within the Labour Party. And I think there's lots of interesting stuff that could be done around the local power plan. In fact, Commonwealth did a very good report recently by Nick Pierce. Who did this thing, and so Abundance is quite interested in, or we're very interested in public common partnerships, reverse engineer public-private partnerships. And so Nick Pierce he sort of like scoped out, well, you could actually do public common partnerships for local energy generation, but it's sort of that thing of like, so basically it would be, instead of like the state de-risking private enterprises, they'd be de-risking sort of like commonly owned enterprises, right? That's the public common bit of that. But the good thing about Nick's plan was that like you do then have to think about coordination at the next level up, basically, perhaps on a regional level and on a national level, and like the amount of democracy from below you can build into those sorts of structures. Do you know what I mean? And at a certain level, perhaps it becomes too unwieldy. And I think that is the sort of thing you'd have to think about if you were, in a way, what you want, if we just to move into political strategy, like I think we would basically need to do that, building up this public common coordination of economic activity from the bottom, as part of the way that you win the battle to do, to do that like public coordination at a bigger level of scale, which I think is what you were asking earlier, Ellie.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how this whole sphere has become like such a political battleground and like such a point of like interest because of GB Energy. But I think as well, kind of going back to what you were saying about doubling the number of cooperatives and the opportunities around that. And I think it's interesting the way that we're considering this as a small scale thing, because when you look at some of the stuff that's happened elsewhere, I mean, I'm talking about like Germany, for example, or the number of like energy communities that exist in Europe. I personally think we could be more ambitious, but I do work for a cooperative that is an energy kind of cooperative doing work on retrofits, so maybe I'm biased, but I'll pass back to Andrew.
Well, I think that leads us on to this, but the other side of the equation is that, okay, Labour wants to have GB Energy, they want to be net zero by 2030, so they could produce as much solar power as they want, but actually the other thing we have to be doing is the reduction of energy, let me put that in a better way, otherwise people think I'm a radical degrowther and trying to, will try and admonish me with a study. We have to get, be more energy efficient, so the amount of energy that we produce is used properly and we're not just wasting stuff for the sake of, we're just being inefficient. So like, I've not heard much on Labour's side about insulation and retrofit. Obviously they're pushing a lot on producing a lot more housing, and they're going to be taking a hammer and spade to the planning system, which, going back to something you said earlier, Keir, about, there's a big thing right now in planning around biodiversity net gain, which has to be worked out, which has just come in and is absolutely ripping local authorities' planning systems apart because they don't really know what to do about it because there's not much funding. And then we add this into the mix. It's like the actual environment to do this from a local level, from local government, is quite difficult, especially I think at a district level, at the kind of local authority level that I work at, because we're being pulled in every which way direction with lots of legislation and ambition and not much more resource. So I think I'd want to see more on that side, so that I'd at least know that they know about that. There's two prongs to this attack, as opposed to just going, well, we're going to build wind turbines everywhere. Any comments on any of that?
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the points about retrofit are really interesting, in the sort of warm homes plan. I was very fortunate to do an event with Rowan Mataram from the Transnational Institute a little while ago, and one of the things that she talked about was that one of the best actions we can take in the global north to deal with our energy consumption and the impacts that we're having on the global south is to reduce it, and retrofit is a very clear way to try and reduce our energy consumption. I think as someone who is working for Carbon Co-op, we originated in retrofit, but we now do a lot more than that. I think what's quite significant with the lack of kind of discussion around that, and Labour did have the Warm Homes Plan within their sort of manifesto. Haven't seen as much about that, or maybe it's just not been as talked about as GB Energy.
Because who does that fall under, actually? Who's going to be running with that? Is that going to be under Rayner? Or is there? I
think so. That's my impression.
Okay.
She's very much on the sort of, definitely within the social housing sort of space. But I think what's interesting about that is that fundamentally there's when it comes to energy generation, you're contending with the planning system, you're contending with all of these different layers, but you're not going into people's homes, and you don't need consent in that way to basically invade people's personal space. So when it comes to retrofit, it's such a massive thing, and it's so fundamentally seen as like a list of targets. And like when it comes to publicly funded schemes, you've got all of these kind of homes that people are going to be going into and taking up space in, and making changes to fundamentally energy systems that people are used to. And there's not really a plan around how to engage people with that. And I think that's where, again, I know I'll always come back to like the people and the social aspect of this, because like the technical barriers are one thing, the non-technical barriers to this are huge. So I think there's always got to be a question of like how people are actually involved in shaping the energy system. And when it comes to retrofit, you really can't do it without like people being part of that. So yeah, and I think there's more to say around planning. I mean, there's an interesting kind of question around how the reforms to energy planning are going to overlap with things like economic geographies, how that's going to feed into questions about supply chain skills, like all that sort of stuff, and kind of the green skills and jobs agenda. And also the fact that currently within a consultation for regional energy strategic planning, again, there's proposals around providing support to local authorities around area or local area energy planning, but nothing about engagement. So it's just interesting what's in there and what isn't, and how people are and aren't kind of being integrated into this as a whole kind of picture. So
can I add an element of just to ramp up? I'm going to turn the scepticism about Labour dial up to 11, just because I was a little bit complimentary, and I can't appear on Twitter if I don't give them a kick at the same time. No, because like one of the things with like this idea of like planning reform is that like I'm worried that that's going to be like people talk about regulatory de-risking. You just change the regulations to suit the big developers. And my worry is that like if you look outside GB Energy at like the National Wealth Fund and this other bit which looks very much like de-risking, so like there's this, what is it, 7.3 billion National Wealth Fund, once again like tiny sums, but like but the mantra with that is that for every pound of like of public money they want £3 of private money back, and so that's like de-risking basically. And like the logic of de-risking is like like it's a strange logic, de-risking, right? So because it's like, we're going to do, it's like public coordination of like policy priorities. We're like, we're going to work out what our public policy priorities are, and then we're going to sort of like change the investability decisions that private actors make. We're going to take the risks off people, basically. So it's this really odd mix of like two economic logics, like one which is private investors and like some sort of market discipline should function, but we're actually going to intervene so that like the rewards that private investors are supposed to get because of the risks they take, they still get them even though they don't get the risk. So that seems to not follow the sort of market logic, you know what I mean? And so that you've got sort of like with de-risking, you've got these two like economic logics going alongside each other, and their intention. And under de-risking, right, the one is subordinated to the other. The state is de-risking the market. The state is in a subordinate relationship to capital, basically. And so the big problem with that, this is like Daniela Gabor is the theorist who does.
I've been trying to get her on this podcast forever. I love Daniela. She's fantastic.
But here she says like the big problem with this is that like this is all sticks and no carrots, basically. How do you exercise discipline is the big problem, which is something we talked about before, which is like that carbon has got to stay in the ground, basically.
It's very much, I'm going to give you everything you want, but you better be nice about it.
I actually don't love the framing sticks versus carrots, because I think it kind of gives the impression that like discipline also works upon capital, and I think just in like so many of these areas the issue is actually just displacing it as like the main actor, especially for these like big systems. Like I think even with like leaving aside electricity, but like even just like wind down of fossil fuel production, like I think that there's like an idea that we can kind of like discipline, and even through like pretty weak measures. Like I think that a lot of proposals around using like penalizing factors through central banks and other kind of like financial regulation just kind of like maybe will raise the cost of capital for projects and like make certain financial assets a little bit less liquid. And like even through like pretty heavy like regulation, like it would take like an outright ban to get these actors to kind of like whole cloth abandon their investments and assets. And you face disorderly divestment scenarios through that too. And I think just like in general, there's so many of these aspects where like electricity, fossil fuel production, you could probably name a few others. You basically just like want the state to take it over, or have like public options. Like maybe for steel decarbonization, we need a public option for steel, or at least like the kind of like inputs or whatever. And so I think that the idea of like you could just discipline capital, and the problem with de-risking is we're just being too nice to capital. It's like we just need to like not do this through capital, if that makes sense.
I mean, another way to think about or to frame that would be like there are different modes upon which we can have social reproduction, or we can organize social reproduction. And at the moment, like there's a sort of social mode, and that's subordinated underneath capital mode of reproduction, and that is the problem basically, because capital has its own dynamics. It needs to expand, etc., etc.
Like I suppose the story this week at Tata Steel in Port Talbot is quite instructive in this, actually, in terms of Labour was going to bung them 500 million for them to keep one of the furnaces on, and then the company's just like, nah, actually, don't worry about it, and they're just going to close it instead, while they look to do this transition to these arc electric reactors, which require furnaces that require a lot less people to manage them. So there's a huge outlay of people that have lost their jobs from that and are still living in that area, that have to find something new to do, that would probably be perfect to get them into jobs. Well, this is a thing. I feel like I'm happy to be the bad person in the room. I find myself becoming very kind of like paternalistic and say, oh, these workers lost their jobs in steel, we should get them jobs working on wind turbines and other stuff. It's like, that sounds nice, but it's like, well, what if they don't want to fucking do that? Like, it's the question that I feel like no one ever asks.
I don't think it's not the same sort of sector there, is it? That's the problem.
Well,
there is not jobs on. There might be jobs constructing wind turbines, but like you don't have to go in. You know what I mean? And but crank the turbine to keep it producing. That's not how it works.
But I think it is that kind of logic of like, well, these people that I've never thought about before can do any job I think they should do, because that's where they fit, in the system, as opposed to they're people that should have their own agency and have communities and have thoughts about what they might want to do. Which,
I think
to
what's
Ellie's point, must be in all this as well.
What's interesting with that, I think, is as well, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the role of trade unions within this. And I think that, when it comes to those industries, again, kind of to flag the work of Platform here, like the report that they did, Our Power, which was basically with oil rig workers or workers within the oil industry, trying to explore what a good transition plan would look like for them, is really significant. And I think the fact that at the moment there isn't, as we've discussed, trying to stop more fossil fuels being dug out the ground is a massive thing, but also when it comes to where those workers go, and it's exactly what you just said, it's like, where are the people in this? Like, if they don't have a say in what happens to their industries and their futures, if you don't involve people, of course they're going to kick off. No one, change is inevitable, but we don't like it. I think that there's a real thing here with the trade unions, but also the fact that you have some trade unions that are saying that green policies are costing us jobs. And it's like, oh, okay. So it goes back to that point that Keir made earlier. Like, you can have community on both ends of this spectrum. You can have people within the trade unions who are absolutely for kind of green policies and tackling climate change, and you can have people at the other end of the spectrum who are making the argument around this is going to hollow out our communities, and all of that was in relation to Port Talbot and Tata Steel. So there's a really fundamental thing here about that clash from a social perspective that could result from an energy transition done badly. And I think it's just interesting to consider the role of trade unions within all of this and what that looks like in new industries. And also final thing, they're not green jobs, they're just jobs. So that framing is so frustrating a lot of the time. But sorry, rant over.
Covers up a lot of evils, doesn't it? Because the wind turbine production, solar production in the UK, very low amounts of trade union density in those sectors. Yeah. So it's not a case of going, well, I went for my good paid job at Port Talbot that was I had decent working conditions, as much as you can do working in a furnace, to a job. Say they go into this wind farm job where they've got bad hours or no protection for those working conditions, and their wage is what they've been told they're going to get, which is not a good place to start with, and a very good way to probably like you say, piss loads of people off.
This might sound like it's a little out of left field, but I do think that one of the most important climate policies in just a political economy sense is the fight for full employment, or pushing for fuller and fuller employment as a way to kind of increase worker bargaining power. And I'm not usually one to champion Bidenomics or just the U.S. economic policy in general, but I think it's actually quite telling that early on in the pandemic, the U.S. received quite a lot of, I think, scorn from Europeans because the way that we approached our kind of emergency support packages was kind of more income-based support for people, kind of increase unemployment. It made it easier to get unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas in Europe, I think there was more of a focus on keeping people in their existing jobs. And I think really a thing that you saw in the U.S. context is actually quite a lot of people that were in really shitty service jobs because they suddenly had unemployment, and then also kind of as the recovery period began, vaccine rollouts, there was a state of fuller employment. Workers were able to, leave bad jobs for better jobs, bargain for better conditions in their existing jobs, or kind of moving into new fields. I feel like that's analogous to the transition where any given worker in a fossil fuel field might have better benefits and such because of past trade union activity or whatever. But the biggest problem is just increasing the dignity of work in society in general, and what's the best way to do that is by increasing worker power. So
I mean, I think you've got to appreciate the hustle of Donald Trump getting his name in all those checks as well. I think that's that's Keir, you were going to say something.
Well, no, it's just made me start thinking about when we talked about unions, about the class composition of different forms of energy production, basically. Do you know what I mean? As in, the strongest unions in the UK were the mine National Union of Mine Workers, etc. And and that's because of like the form of digging up coal, basically. You know, they tended to be sort of like, you know, outside of the big cities. Although where I live in Leeds, actually, there was a mine just about 500 yards that way. But like, you know, so you have like communities who are based around one big workshop, one big workplace, etc. Dangerous work always produces like strong bonds of solidarity, same with dock work, etc. That sort of stuff. And then you see, like, when we have like the sort of like shift towards oil, it's like, you know, part of that is to do with class composition and like, you know, it's a very different sort of structure of production, etc. You know, it's in different parts of the world, etc. That sort of stuff. And then, so like for unions, I think when they look at like green jobs, I'm doing inverted commas. It's not very good for a podcast, but you know, you're going to need a different form of like thinking about organisation. And I do think it is that sort of like, you know, renewable energy generation. You're not talking about big mass workplaces, basically.
No, you need like
have mine workers, but it might
two
be
guys look after
is...
like a solar farm pretty much for 25 years. Well, that's it.
Yeah.
Like,
well, but you might have like, it may not lend itself to the National Union of Mine Workers, that sort of worker strength, but it might lend itself to something else, which is like, you know, like community ownership of and control over renewable energy generation is probably much more. It's much easier to think through than like, you know, than like community ownership over Drax, which is in Solby, not far from here, for instance, right? Which is, you know, that's a different sort of level of scale of energy generation.
I think also this might go back to the initial discussion of the winter fuel payments, but I think that there is also, I think, kind of, you know, with the energy transition and the fact that there perhaps are sectors where they're moving to a new capital equipment stock or infrastructure stock might entail fewer workers in any given field. That's only a problem under capitalism or in a society where you face unemployment and that's like quite violent. And I think that like we should be thinking about like how to make it positive that you know these activities that are quite like important to modern society, like steel production, electricity, you know, infrastructure rollout or whatever, requires fewer workers. And like what actually does require more people, it's like care and you know and people do want that. Like people want their loved ones to be cared for. I think that, you know, it's not that like I personally want just like endless care responsibilities in my life, but you know, you do benefit from that in terms of like being like sharing life in common with people and having responsibilities. And I think that like any kind of better world, we'd all have more caring responsibilities anyway. But just kind of thinking about like how, you know, through the transition, like these things that are often like I think that there is in the climate community kind of a growing awareness of these political economy problems. Like you have to solve for the loss of, you know, steel jobs or what have you. But I think that that's often kind of going in this direction of like trying to do the like this, you know, the fossil fuel to X, you know, green industry pipeline or what have you, as opposed to thinking about like how can we just reorder society and like and direct our resources, including labor, to things that are important, and we can make that activity like more meaningful and not so, you know, poorly paid, etc.
The bind we're in though is that like we also need the force, the leverage to get there. And like you know, in the 20th century, or the early parts of the 20th century, that force came from like not good jobs. Like it wasn't good to be a mine worker. It fucking destroyed your health, and it wasn't pleasant. But it gave like a huge amount of working class power, which is very hard to reproduce in something like the care sector, for instance. You know. But you just need different forms of strategy and organisation. That's what I'd say in those sorts of sectors.
I think that's also kind of the same in terms of like how we think about energy as well. Like thinking about it as like, okay, I turn on this light switch and the light bulb comes on, or like I think about the gas power station down the road, or about what goes in as opposed to how it's used and why we're using it and what it does. Which I think is the kind of having to imagine in completely different ways to organise things, you know, society at large is probably the job we all should be getting paid for to do. Like and subscribe, join the Patreon, guys. And Ellie, you want to come in with a question? Save me from my commercialisation.
No, I think the conversation we've just been having is really interesting. And I think the point about kind of where where the the class composition of different industries, and thinking about, Keir, what you mentioned about kind of community ownership of like energy generation or something like that. But one thing that I'd like to put to you guys, and this is thinking about just transition and I guess how we situate ourselves in relation to the global south and frontline communities when we're thinking about different technologies, is I read a book recently, which was great. It was by some academics who've been doing loads of work in Norway and Denmark, and it's very nerdy, and it's all about resource rent tax and this sort of thing. But one of the questions, or one of the titles of their first chapters was "Who owns the sun?" And I think when we're thinking about like previously,
Nice.
when we're thinking about kind of natural resources and the fact that in the UK we obviously had a massive kind of mining industry, we have offshore kind of North Sea oil and gas. Whole other thing about how we've managed that. But now that we're thinking about kind of renewables and generation, there's a different kind of relationship that we have to our natural resources, in that we're not the ones who are creating the things that allow us to generate that energy. That is happening abroad. And also when we're thinking about like electric vehicles and lithium and all of these sort of things, so it may be that we are in a better position in terms of like how we might relate to how energy is generated and what our energy system looks like. But how can we then contend with that question of just transition in the global south? And I'd be interested to know what you both think.
I feel like I have thoughts going in like two different directions. So like one probably like thinking about like domestic energy, or just kind of like in a broad sense. That I think that like what you're saying about just renewables being kind of just different in nature than fossil fuels, I think that's a thing for the left to really take forward. And my boss, Matt Lawrence, I don't know if you're familiar with him. I find him the corniest writer, but in the best way. Like, it's often like, oh, I wish I just had this ability to be this way. And he just will like pontificate, like the commonwealth of the wind and the wave should be democratically stewarded, which I think is absolutely true. But I think
I'm buying that merch. I'm buying it.
I want on a t-shirt.
But I think kind of getting more technical too, there's something about, like, I know you've interviewed Brett Christophers before, not to like rehearse his argument, but it just is this like baffling paradox that the fact that renewables, it's expensive to build relatively, but then once you build it, it just produces power across its lifetime, and we could have really, really cheap electricity, which is this core economic input. It determines the price of so many other inputs, just like things in our society. And like that's a problem under the current, even just like for the electricity sector, even leaving aside the rest of like social or organization. I think just like taking forward that we can kind of have this like different future around this energetic base, I think it's like a really beautiful and politically powerful idea. I think that kind of relates to the global dimension as well, where it is certainly true that like these supply chains are, entail things that are quite bad, like lithium mining, etc. But I think also kind of in a separate domain, and it's like a discussion on its own. The way that the global north is relating to the global south in terms of the energy transition is very much like trying to push global south countries to decarbonize, but offering no material support, even though the entire relationship of the global north to global south is structured around this monetary and financial and economic hierarchy. So they're denying the capacity to undertake the transition. And I think that there are many societies, even, relatively developed countries like Indonesia or India that are in the G20, they're relatively wealthy in global context, have not achieved full electrification of their societies yet. And I think that there's something to be said for pushing for like this shared vision of like electricity, and like what would it entail to like not just decarbonize, but just like what is the point of getting up and going to work every day and just doing activity if there are people that don't have electricity in the world, and like what is the global project to do that? What I think is like different than just saying, oh, there's a financing gap that we need to fill, and kind of like this like UNFCCC language that like my mom does not care about, or this is not, it's not legible to people at all. As opposed to, I think most people do want other people around the world to like, be doing well and having these resources.
Yeah.
I mean, it's difficult, isn't it? Basically, that, and I haven't got a pat answer because like there's where we need to get to, and then what seems possible at the current moment. There's a fucking big gap, basically, and one of those biggest gaps is like we need to think about what we do in the UK about like a green transition. Like you have to think about, well, like you have to almost anticipate like really quite fundamental changes in relationship to the global south. Otherwise, you basically think, oh well, in that case, it's just about building, electric cars, etc. Well, great. Yeah. Now we've got to pillage like lithium from around the world. Yeah. We've got to stage a coup against Evo Morales and all this sort of stuff, basically. Do you know, it's that. In a way, it's like I think the current situation just like it does pose an anti-capitalist sort of question, basically, because it's this like the most basic question is like, what the fuck have we been doing for 30 years? Right? And that only makes sense if you realise that there's like this core of there's like capitalism is completely, it's organised in a rational way, but like the only irrational bit about it is the whole thing, basically. Capital. Like the aim of it is like to produce a surplus so that you can invest the surplus to produce a surplus. That is meaningless, irrational way to organise your economic activity, and like so what you get is like this huge explosion of like bullshit economic activity, which is like it demands more and more like energy and material throughput. So like I know where the end where that what is necessary is to sort of like stop that, basically, on a global level. The gap between that and like what currently seems possible to do is like quite big. So you need to sort of like think about how do you cross that gap by building up, developing our forces, developing our capability and like political leverage and these sorts of things. But like as soon as you start thinking on a global level, it's incredibly difficult to think that through or how that might happen.
Yeah, and I think actually kind of the relationship between, with the global south from the global north is basically, I feel like, the same logic as it's been for the last 100 years in terms of like fossil capital. It's like, okay, we're not doing oil anymore, we're going to get lithium out of Congo instead. Okay, we're going to get cobalt from Nicaragua, whatever. We're going to put our thing here and we'll have our strange enterprise zone here in Honduras that will do whatever it wants and you can't engage with it. That's a mention for the Trash Future listeners if they're out there. It's all fucked. What a great place to end, as ever. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. Right, we get to the part of the show where we spread a little bit of love and give some thanks to the people that are doing good work, whether it's anyone out there. It's the shout out. I'm going to start with this week's co-host, which is Ellie. Ellie, who are your shout outs this week?
So my first shout out is Summer, the cat, who I've been cat sitting this week, who has kept me sane whilst preparing various bits and pieces for projects I'm managing. But in terms of people, just the whole Carbon Co-op team, I think they're class. They're doing brilliant work, turning theory into practice and doing great stuff. So
excellent.
Yeah.
Melanie, who do you want to give a shout out to this week?
Yeah, so I'm not sure when this episode will air, but we're recording in mid-September, and just this week the US-based think tank Climate and Community Project relaunched as Climate and Community Institute, and they do really fantastic work. And I think that the changing of the name is not just like a cheeky rebranding. Also, it was funny that they were named CCP, but I think the institution element I think is like really important, because I think it's great that they've done such fantastic work, and also the hope is that this really marks a moment where they're like a big institution and will just continue to further, really political and technical solutions to democratizing, decarbonizing, and decommodifying our economy. And also, I think on some of the themes that we have discussed, I've known Johanna Boslowa for a long time, including we were in our first union together. And I think that there's no one who really practices economic democracy and equality within the workplace as the executive director of CPAI, so very proud of them.
Fantastic. We'll put some links in the show notes for them. Keir?
Unexpectedly to myself, I've just thought that I want to do a shout out to Green Organise, which is like so the Green conference was Green Party conference was last week, and like a new sort of like, I don't know, what would you call it? Not faction or organisation within the Green Party, like left Green Party members, was pulled together called Green Organise. I'm not in the Green Party, but that sort of thing. Like we're in a real sort of like political. We're not quite sure what we're doing in the UK, so we need that. We need people still active in the Labour Party. We need people that are on the outside of the Labour Party, and we need people outside of like electoral politics altogether. So shout out to Green Organise, good initiative.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Lovely to see you all, and whatever you're doing out there, keep fighting for a better, more just world, and we'll see you next week. Thanks and goodbye. Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you liked it or enjoyed it, please leave a review or a comment on iTunes and Spotify and tell your friends. Or if you really like the show, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/gndmediauk. And here's a special shout out to all our top tier patrons, including Quilty O'Connor, Guillermund, Harriet Williams, Jill Burke, Karen Taylor, Kaylee Woods Harley, Lizzie, Marie Louise O'Hanrahan, Steve Smith, and Joe Lindstone.